All right, hey there everybody, welcome back. So today we're going to be taking and making our little ship here that has some nice kind of space-like movement forwards and backwards, and we're even going to add a braking thrust so that if we're going in either direction we can just hold down one specific button and it's going to cause us to brake. So thanks for joining and let's get started. Okay, welcome back. So last time we left off, we had just talked about setting up GameMaker Studio 2, creating the project, and then we talked about some of the naming conventions in GameMaker Studio 2. So today we're going to create our ship, and we're going to get it to move around. So what I want you to do is first, after you download the Superpowers asset pack, it's going to come as a zip file, so if you have Windows, just right-click and choose Extract All. If you have a Mac, just double-click it, and then it'll extract it. And then you'll get this folder that says Superpowers Asset Packs. If you open that up, inside there, we're going to look for the Space Shooter Asset Pack. I'm going to copy this. So right click, choose copy. I'm going to go to my documents, GameMaker Studio 2, and then SolarWinds Knockoff, which was the project that we started. I'm going to right click and paste to put that in there. And it might take a second depending on your computer, but there we go. We've got our assets inside our project now. Now what I want to do first is I'm going to make a sprite for our player, but I know ahead of time that I'm probably going to have a lot of sprites associated with the player. Maybe a shield sprite, some weapons, other things like that, not just the ship. So with sprites selected, I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose to add a group. And I'm going to call this group player sprites. And then in the player sprites, I'm going to right click and choose to create a sprite. And using the naming conventions, I'm going to call this SPR_player for the player sprite. Now, if you wanted to, at this point, you could create your own image. GameMaker gives you a blank canvas. You can go to Edit Image. It'll bring you to here, and you can create whatever image you want. But we're not going to do that today. Instead, we're going to go to Import, and we want to import from Space Shooter in our own project, Ships, and then choose whichever of these ships you want to start with. Now I'm going to choose this little red one just because that looks the closest to what I envision in my mind when I think of this project. So I'm going to double click on that and I will import it. Now there's one problem with the way that these ships are oriented. GameMaker Studio sees 0 degrees as being to the right. So currently with our ship pointing up like this, it's actually pointing at 90 degrees. Now because of some of the things that we want to do, we're going to be able to want to rotate this. And rather than having to always make some calculations in the background as to exactly what the rotation should be, we're just going to rotate the sprite to begin with. So I want to go to Edit Image, and then that'll bring us to this folder, or not folder, this tab. And then we're going to choose Image, and we want to rotate all frames clockwise 90 degrees. And that's it. That's all we want to do. I'm going to save this, get out of here. Now, I want to make sure on Sprite Player that my center, or my origin, is not at the top left, but I'll explain why in just a second. For now I'm going to leave it alone, but I'll explain why we don't want it in the top left in a moment. Now the next thing to do is to go to the objects, right click, we're going to create an object, we're going to call this is the player's object, so it makes sense to call it obj_player. Now, you can choose right away over here what kind of sprite you want. So you've got the name, the sprite that you're using, and you can create a new sprite if you want. We're just going to click that, and then this allows us to open up our groups and choose SPR_player. We'll talk about the collision mask stuff very soon, but we're eventually going to make it so it's not the same as the sprite because that makes things just a little more complex in the background. We have this list of events that we can add, and I'll show you what an event is in just a moment. A parent talks about which behaviors this is going to inherit to begin with. Physics, which we're not going to be using too much here, and then variable definitions, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So the first thing I want to do is I want to add an event. So right now we're in the Events tab. So if I go to Add Event, there's 4 main kinds of events. I know it can be kind of intimidating to see all of this, but the 4 main kinds of events are create, step, draw, and collision. Now, for now, I'm going to be using some that aren't part of those 4 main, and the way I'm doing it could be done differently. And I know that other GameMaker Studio tutorials have done it differently than I'm going to. But in my experience, this has been the easiest way for me to explain how to use GameMaker Studio to anybody who's new to it. So first thing I'm going to do is create a create event. So I'm just going to click on that, and it automatically opens up this GameMaker Studio code editing window. Now in here, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so you can see this a little bit better. What I want to do is, before I do anything else, GameMaker already sets up its code events so that it can have a description over here in the event tab to make your life a little bit easier, so that you're not trying to remember what each event does. So the way that you would do that is 3 backslashes, @description, and then anything that comes after @description is the description of the event. So in this case, I'm going to say creating variables for the player. And then when I click away from that, you can see that that shows up over there. Now there's only a few variables we're going to need to make. The first one we're going to make here is how fast we want our ship to rotate when we press the left or right buttons. So we're going to do rotation speed is equal to, and I'm going to set it to 5, completely arbitrary. That would be roughly 5 degrees for every frame. But it's completely arbitrary, and it's something that you can come back here and change later if you want to in just this one spot, instead of needing to change it everywhere else that we would apply rotation. So the next event I'm going to add, so I'm going to go to add event, and this is going to be a keyboard event. And there's a few different kinds of keyboard events. There's key down, which fires as true, so anything that's in that event would get called whenever that key is held down, and you can choose any of these keys or even any key. There's key pressed, which fires only the very first time the button is pressed. And then there's key up, which fires every time you let go. In GameMaker Studio 2, there's even gestures, which I think is really cool. But we're going to go with just a key down event, because if I hold down the left arrow, or you can do like WASD control if you want to, if I hold down whatever I want to move the ship left, I want it to continue to rotate. So I'm going to choose key down left, so it's the left key. And make sure that you're on the right tab over here, because like something might happen and you might be under the create tab. We want to go to the left tab. I'm going to change my description here to be rotate ship left. And then to rotate the ship, we're not really going to need to rotate the object, we're just going to need to rotate the image. So to access the angle of the image in GameMaker Studio, that's image underscore angle. And we want it to, if it's going left, the way that GameMaker sees things is, imagine this is the origin. This is 0 degrees, 90, 180, 270, and then back to 360 or 0. So if we're holding down the left key, we want it to rotate this way. So we're going to want the angle to increase. So 0, 90, 180, so on. So I'm going to say image angle plus equals, which means to take whatever it was and add more to it. And I'm going to add the rotation speed. Now I'm going to do something very similar with the right key. So I'm going to go to key down, right, change, oops. See, I accidentally clicked on the tab there. I want to make sure I'm on the key down right tab. I'm going to change this from insert description to rotate shift or ship right. All right, and then down here, instead of adding to the image angle, I'm going to subtract from it. So image underscore angle minus equals rotation speed. And that's the reason I created rotation speed as a variable in the create event, is because now I don't have to put 5 here and put 5 here, and then maybe later I want it to be like 7 or 8 or 20. I'd have to remember to change it in both spots. Whereas now, if I want to change what the rotation speed is, I just have to change it here, and that variable is referenced anywhere else I need the rotation speed. All right, I'm going to save this. Now we're going to go into our room. So I'm going to double click on room 1. Right now it's just this blank canvas, which we'll come back to later. I'm going to grab my player object and just plop them down in the room just anywhere. I'm going to save this, and then let's hit play. and we'll see our code working, but we'll see an error. So let's see what that is. So there's our ship. If we press left, do you see how it's not rotating the way you'd expect it to? Instead of rotating about its center, it looks like it's rotating about its left wing tip. And the reason that is if we go back to our sprite here, this is our center. So whenever it wants to make a change to its angle, it's rotating about that point. We want it to rotate it about the middle. So I'm going to do middle center for my origin, and I'm going to lock that down. Now, if I save this again and hit play, I should see it working the way I expect it to. So there we go. Now, pixel art doesn't like being rotated like this at odd angles, which is why you can see it looks wrong when it's not perfect, but we'll address that eventually so that it doesn't look quite so stark or out of place. But there we go. Now, the next thing that we want to do as far as our control goes is we want to have the ability to make our ship speed up when we press the up button and slow down or go backwards when we press the back button. So to do that, we're going to create a few more variables here. So I'm going to go to the create event. I'm going to create a variable for movement speed. So movement speed. And I'm going to set it to 16. It's just a random number. I'm also going to take create another. This actually isn't a variable. This is something that's built into GameMaker. So when I create a variable, you can see that they turn purple. That means that they can be used by any event inside this object. However, if I use one of GameMaker Studio's built-in variables, and speed is one of those, you can see it turns green. So GameMaker already has a bunch of things that it thinks it should be able to do with speed, and we're going to be using that. I'm going to set the speed equal to 0 to start, and then I'm going to save this. And now I'm going to add a new event. It's key down, up, and this is going to be to accelerate the ship. Now, GameMaker has a bunch of built-in functions that are going to make our lives easier, but we're going to change the way those functions work so that they look more like what the player would expect. So the player would expect, when they press the up button, not to go immediately from 0 to top speed. They'd expect a little bit of acceleration. So what we're going to do is we're going to check to see what the current speed is. And if it's less than what we want the movement speed to be, we're going to increase it by a little bit. And we're going to keep doing that so long as it's less than our movement speed. So we want to consider our movement speed kind of as like a top speed. Now we're going to do this using an if, then, else statement, except we're not going to be using the else part right now. Now an if, then, else statement is key to programming. We're going to say if, and then we're going to give it something. So I'm just going to write the word something. This is just an explanation. So if this is true, then we want it to do something else. And the thing that we want it to do, this is the then part, is going to go in these curly braces. So if this thing in here is true, then we're going to do this. And you could add an else to it at the end as well. So you could say else something else. So it could be like if you win $1 million, I don't know, you're a millionaire, else you're not a millionaire. Something like that. We're only going to be using the if-then part, though, not the else part. And the something we want to check here is what the value of the speed is. So if speed is less than our movement speed, and remember this starts at 0, speed, then we're going to increase it by a little bit. So I'm going to say speed, this actually needs to be, there we go, speed plus equals 0.05. So that's adding just a little bit to our speed. So I'm going to save that and let's take a look at how this looks. So you see how there's kind of like a slow acceleration there? However, what that's doing is it's just sending our ship just whatever direction it was when it started in. We'd want it to kind of be able to go whichever direction it's pointing. So to do that, we're going to add a new event, and this is a step event. Now a step event is something that happens every frame that the game is playing. And I think by default, GameMaker Studio 2 still puts games at 30 frames per second. Okay, so that's new. Game Maker Studio 2 defaults the room speed to be 60. Now, that doesn't mean that that's how many frames per second it's actually making. It's almost certainly going to be more than that, especially with a simple 2D game like this. That means how often Game Maker Studio is refreshing the script. So, if we go back to our player object here, in this step, I'm going to put as the description refresh every frame. So this is going to refresh itself every frame, which is roughly 60 times a second. So what I want to do with this is I want to use, so we could actually go through the exact math of how this is calculated. So like if our ship is pointing, like say this way at an angle, the exact amount of speed that we should add to it is going to be based on the trigonometry of that angle. So if you ever told your math teacher that you don't think you're ever going to use this in life, here's where you're going to use it. So you need to know the sine and the cosine of that angle in order to know how much velocity it should have in each direction. However, Game Maker Studio knows that most people aren't going to necessarily see that the math could apply there, and so they have a few built-in functions that we're going to take advantage of. The one that we're taking advantage of here is motion_set, and then this takes in, as you can see down here, we need to have a direction and a speed. So for the direction, I'm going to use the angle that the image is at, and for the speed, I'm just going to use whatever the speed is. So I'm going to save that. Now if I go back to, nope, that should do it. So if I save and hit play, we should see our ship's movement working a little bit better now. So you can see that there's like a weird little spiral. That has to do with the fact that the ship still has momentum going into a curve. I actually kind of like it. I think it feels not too bad. And our ship is only going to accelerate to a certain point because if the speed is equal to or greater than the movement speed, it's not going to increase at all. Now we want to do something similar for the down key. So I'm going to add a new event, down, and for my description here, I'm going to call this slow down or reverse. And what this is going to do is check to see if speed is greater than negative movement speed. So if we're going faster than negative whatever our fastest speed is, then we want to take speed and subtract from it a small amount, 0.05. Let's save this. Let's try this now. Alright, so now I can slow it down. And it's got this nice kind of gradual momentum feel to it. Now it would be very hard the way that we're playing right now to get to perfectly still. So, and that's always bugged me about space games, and that's one thing that SolarWinds doesn't do. In SolarWinds, it's not impossible to completely slow down. There's just a button for it. And we're going to make that as well. So in SolarWinds, if you're flying, if you press the space bar, you start to lose speed or gain speed, depending on if you're going forwards or backwards, until you get close to 0. So your speed moves closer and closer to 0. So we're going to add a new event here, and this is going to be for the space key. And this is a key down as well, because we don't want it to go from whatever it was to 0, because that's going to feel weird. I'll show you what that'll feel like here. This is going to be, I don't know, we'll call this braking thrust. Now, if I just in here set speed equal to 0, which might be some people's first instincts, I'll save that, and we'll hit play. This is going to think for a second. It's going to feel really weird, because if let's get the ship going nice and fast, and then it, like, everybody inside that ship just died from, I don't know, falling right into their bones. It doesn't feel right. You'd want it to have a slow deceleration, since it has a relatively slow acceleration. So what I'm going to do here with space is I'm going to check to see if the speed isn't equal to 0 already. So if speed, now to do is not equal to, in math, it's an equal sign with a line through it. But there's no key like that on your keyboard. So in order to do that in programming languages, to do is not equal to, it's exclamation point equal to 0. So if speed is not equal to 0, then we want to make a little curly braces here for our bit of code. So this is the then. So inside our then statement, we're going to add another if statement. We want to see if the speed is positive. So if speed is greater than 0, then we're going to do something. And if speed is not greater than 0, but not equal to 0, that means it must be less than 0. So else, and this else can go on its own line just like that. So it's nice and easy. So this is called a nested if statement. So we've got if speed isn't 0, then we're going to do stuff in here. And then in here, if speed is greater than 0, we'll do this, but we won't do that. If this isn't true, then we'll do that. So if speed is greater than 0, we're going to say speed minus equals 0.05. And if it's not equal to 0 and not greater than 0, that means it's less than speed plus equals 0.05. Now I'm going to save that. I'm going to hit play. And I'm going to make one small change here. I'm sure some of you have already caught me on it. Some of you out there might be calling me a hypocrite already, but I'll show you what that small change is. So if we accelerate the ship and then holding down the space key, it's a pretty, that deceleration is pretty gradual. And let's make sure it works in reverse. So there we go. Now you might want this to be faster. So here's what I'm going to do. Rather than playing around with these variables and needing to change it in a bunch of spots, I'm going to go back to my create event and I'm going to add a braking speed. And I'm going to set my braking speed to be equal to 0.10 and an acceleration speed. That just sounds weird. We'll call it acceleration. 0.05. Now I've created these two new variables. So if I save this, I'm going to double click on acceleration, which will highlight the whole word. Oops, didn't mean to do that. I'll copy by hitting Control-C. And then everywhere I was using acceleration, which was the key down up, I'm going to highlight that and replace it with acceleration. And also key down down, replace this with acceleration. And then back to my create event. I'm going to double click on braking speed, copy that, and now I want to go to my, not my step event, my spacebar event. And I'm going to change this to be braking thrust, so paste, or braking speed, and paste. So I'm going to save this. Now I'm using nice neat variables that are all contained in one spot, so they're easy to change. So if I didn't mean to hit debug. We're not going to talk about debugging today. Oh, well, we might as well. So this is the debugging player. It'll tell you what your average frames per second is. So 8,300 something frames per second right now. There's a lot more that it does than this, but for now we're going to just leave it at that. So there I'm flying around. And now it's a little bit faster. You might actually want it to be faster than that. But this movement I think feels pretty good. Now, next time we're going to talk about how to fire our projectiles. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the description down below. You can follow me on Twitter to find out when I post new videos. You can join my Discord where I'm chatting every day. Tons of really cool people there who know a lot, especially about Game Maker Studio. There's some people there who know more than I do about Game Maker Studio. So if you're looking for help, that's a great place to go. Otherwise, you can join me on Patreon. As little as $1 a month helps me make these videos. But yeah, I hope everybody out there has themselves a wonderful day.